Mr. Reeves is with us. It is 9:03 a.m. This is the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee meeting, November the 15th. And thank you all for being with us. Ms. May, can we start with the roll call?
Sure. Chair Hampton,
Present.
Vice Chair Blair, here. Commissioner Popkin. Checking the online folks just to make sure. Overlooking anybody. And then we also have Mr. Hall.
Present.
And Mr. McGregor.
Present.
And Mr. Reeves.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Berry. Here. Oh.
Popkins, see those. AP on the end, is that AP?
Yeah.
No.
It's planning and urban.
Oh, sorry.
Don't need Okay, and from the city attorneys, we have Miss Suzanne Knuckle. Knuckle. I was like, I know that there's something else. And Mr. Green?
Yes.
Okay. And we have Ms. Levy. And I think that's it.
And do we have any city plan commissioners online?
No.
Okay, thank you, Ms. May. And for the record, Ms. Backley is going to be absent today. So thank you all for being here. We do have a quorum. We have one discussion item on our agenda today. Ms. Levy, thanks for being with us. I see you've got your presentation up. Do you start with the reading the item into the record and your case report, please?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. The item this morning is DCA 212007, consideration of amending Chapter 51A of the Dallas Development Code, Section 51A-4.701D, 2-year limitation, to revise the applicability of the 2-year limitation, the standard for the waiver of 2-year limitation, and related regulations. Shall I begin presentation?
Yes,
This morning, I'll go over the background and the history of the 2-year limitation, our purpose for the code amendment, some of the issues and operational or business concerns that we have, staff recommendation, and the next steps. On May 11, 2022, the CPC approved the code amendment. And the request was brought to us from Vice Chair Brent Rubin, along with Chair Joanna Hampton and Commissioner Michael Young, to consider a code amendment of the Chapter 51A 4.701D 2-year limitation. And the purpose was to consider, the amendment was to consider revising the applicability standards for the waiver and related regulations. The intent of the code amendment is to review the current 2-year waiting period for subsequent zoning changes and applications, including specific use permit applications when the property has been granted previous approval previously.
for our members online, you may be seeing the presentation more quickly than we are here in the meeting.
So the code amendment supports the goal to undergo our regulatory review to remove barriers to growth and development. It also directly correlates to our economic development policy, which is to analyze and improve our development review processes to encourage predictability with the larger goal of leveraging diverse ranges of commercial and industrial development opportunities in all areas of the city. And this is in order to meet 10-year demand for business growth in the city of Dallas. The code amendment will reduce the number of 2-year waiver applications presented to CPC as well.
Okay.
Sorry, some issues here too.
Yeah.
It's so under this section, 51A 4.701D 2-year limitation, the section applies to subsequent applications for approvals that are granted for all zoning changes, including SUPs, unless the SUP has a 2-year or less time frame of a renewal imposed when that SUP is granted approval. Also, it applies to any denials with prejudice. And the issues that are arising from the 2-year waiver right now is that the only way that an applicant can get a waiver granted from the 2-year waiting period is to go through CPC, City Plan Commission, and gain that approval. And, you know, of course, that adds additional time frame onto the whole development process. And that, you know, theoretically, it adds at least a month to that usual already 2 public hearing process. But I think, as we know, in the real world, it actually would extend it longer than that, more than likely. Did you?
May I ask a question? Could you elaborate a bit on denial with prejudice? What exactly? I'm sure that's illegal. Exactly what does it mean?
Right. Basically, when a denial is, you know, issued as a final action, if the commission or the council does not state without prejudice, then they are saying, you know, that's it. You know, if they say with prejudice, that means they intend for that motion to stay, basically. You know, it's saying they don't really want to see that again, come back again. So that basically triggers this 2-year waiver, because if they say with prejudice, that means this 2-year limitation applies, and they can't, you know, they can't really get the waiver unless they go through the CPC process. So if the commission or the council says denial without prejudice, that means it's a denial, but they're, you know, it's okay that it would come back. You know, in other words, it may be, maybe they just need more information. Maybe they didn't do everything they needed to do. It's not ready. And so they deny it because they can't approve it, but they don't mind if it comes back, you know, with more information. It just means maybe it's not ready yet. It's not, more of a soft denial, if that makes any sense.
So with prejudice would force them to wait the 2-year period before bringing it up again.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is
Without prejudice, conceivably could bring it up within.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, no, just, if I'm not mistaken, with prejudice, it could make it through council, but with a supermajority vote.
Yes, any
Yes.
denial is a supermajority.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, any.
Yes, yes.
So no difference between prejudice.
And I will say I would just, I think from the commissioner's standpoint, there are times where we have denied without prejudice, very specifically anticipating that it will come back, because we know that there's either community input, that there are other factors. It's not ready to move forward, and that is sometimes part of our comments that we make in considering the case.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, question from Mark Reeves?
Mr. Reeves,
Yes,
sorry,
thank you.
I
Just,
don't see everybody,
Yeah.
so please do speak up if you're online.
okay, so a denial with prejudice, that also includes, just for clarification, and I think I know the answer, but you never know, right? Is that if it's denied with prejudice, it's not the applicant that's denied, it's the property. So applicant A comes in and says, I want to build a racetrack on a single story lot or a single family lot, and we go, no, with prejudice, denied. But then somebody else comes back and says, I want to build a single family house and I need to go over like 1 foot over a property line, something silly. Even that second applicant can't come back for 2 years if the first applicant was denied with prejudice. Is that correct?
Ms. Lee,
I believe it's actually the property.
and,
Um,
well,
yeah,
Mr. Reed, would you
it's
like
the
to
property.
confirm that?
Looking at the 2-year limitation, it says no further applications may be considered for that property for 2 years. So seems to be
Because it only goes with the land, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves, good clarification.
It is a
So in a way, that right there, if I'm the owner of that property, it kind of keeps my expectations pretty good. And that it kind of limits me with just something absolutely crazy. But if I own that property and I've done a deal with somebody else that wants to do something, because a lot of these transactions don't go through until they get their zoning, right? I think that happens quite a lot. But that applicant is also looking at like, okay, I'm not going to accept something crazy here because if it gets denied with prejudice, then I can't go back. Would that be kind of a true gray statement?
Yes, you're getting some nods. I will verbalize the yes for those online.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Great. Other questions, or Ms. Levy, if you want to continue?
Thank you.
Just want to enhance and underscore what her first bullet says is that, so we've discussed the denials with prejudice, they have to wait 2 years. But the code also requires that approvals wait 2 years. So just wanted to underscore that.
What does that mean?
That means that if you grant a zoning change or council grants a zoning change, they have to wait 2 years before they can come back and apply, just submit an application. They have to wait 2 years to submit
I
a
mean,
new
an application
application
unless they
on
get
the same property,
unless they get the waiver.
unless they get a waiver.
As currently written, it's any zoning change.
Yes.
Approval, denial without prejudice. Any change to the property that is subject to your waiver as written.
Unless it's without.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's the important distinction.
Thank you,
Denial.
Mr. Drea. I went too far.
I have a question regarding,
Commissioner Poppins.
I'm wondering if, does that include minor amendments?
No. That's a good question.
It's a different process.
No.
Mr. Drea, weigh in. I believe
I am
that's a
here.
different process.
Good
Thank-
morning. This is Andrea Udra with Planning and Urban Design. I'm sorry, but I'm in the office. So no, it refers specifically to zoning changes. So code is very clear, zoning changes. We did have an interpretation that says an SUP is a zoning change, actually. So it does apply to specific use permits, but it does not apply to minor amendments. So basically, if you have a retail strip and the SUP applies to the entire property, if it's one unit that has an SUP for childcare, for alcohol serving, the other units will have to wait or get a waiver if they want to add an additional SUP. So we get in all these situations. Again, just keep that in mind that it applies to SUPs as well.
So another, of course, big cause of concern or issue is that the commission, in order to grant a waiver of the 2-year limitation, has to consider changed circumstances regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing. And, so that's not real clear, but that is what the commission is charged with in order to grant one of the 2-year limitations that might be applicable to an approval or a denial.
Are the circumstances themselves defined, or is there a guideline to what constitutes a change circumstance?
It is not, and, it's general because, there's no way
You
you
can't
can
anticipate.
capture every potential situation, so it really have to be case by case.
I don't know if I'm, unless Dr. Adrea wants to talk about it, but typically staff recommends denial of the waivers because historically, staff's bar of changed circumstances that are significant is a really significant, really high hurdle to meet. But I think,
Yes.
yes. Would you like to add?
I
to
would
that?
add, yes, I would add to that the way staff looked at it historically was it has to be a circumstance that's outside of your control. So if it's basically something that you cannot foresee or you cannot control, is not something that necessarily is self-imposed. We looked at it more like a hardship, like you have an easement that you didn't know about, or right away increase that you didn't know about, or whatever thing again. And I know that during the pandemic, I think we had a few applications that were saying that the pandemic itself was a change in circumstance. I don't recall if staff supported those or not. So it's very rare that we've seen that staff was able to say, okay, this is a change in circumstance per our standards. But this is the standard that we apply to ourselves. The City Plan Commission, every time they look at waivers, they try to get more criteria for that change in circumstance and more concrete criteria to guide their decision.
Thank you, Mr. Durant.
So, yes, so another big issue, and I think this is really the underlying issue that we're dealing with, is that, at the end of the day, there's development delays that are being caused by this process. And part of the research that we performed or, just conducted on this was to see that all 8 waiver applications during the fiscal years of 2020 to 22 have been granted. So, went through the whole process and they got approved. And that's, at the end of the day, again, that really adds a significant amount of time to the application process, the development process. And that's, again, we just have to bring it back to, at the end of the day, it's affecting development and growth in the city of Dallas. So most waiver applications that were reviewed were made to correct inconsistencies in the preceding zoning or SUP ordinance, to adjust for changes in market conditions, which obviously are beyond our control, and for unrelated use to the new application requiring a waiver. Again, it affects that property, and there may be another use on a larger property that an applicant wants to bring forward. That's additional growth for that, for the city. It's a totally different use, and it would be encumbered by this rule, this 2-year limitation.
So since my district is captured in a few of these, I was going to give some examples that might help. So I know one, I'm going to market conditions. We had a PD that was established that was put in place. It was a year, it was 18 months later, and the applicant wanted to consider a new use that wasn't allowed within the base zoning district. So it's planned development district. It used regional retail, as I recall, for its base. They wanted to add essentially a medical laboratory use. That wasn't allowed use. That would be an example of a changed market condition. They had the opportunity for a new tenant to build their building, plan his office. So that would be an example of a market condition. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And
And it just spurred by that initial application and development, you've got market conditions and growth opportunities coming that wouldn't have happened had that first application not been made, right?
And so then one, I can't think of one that's an inconsistency in the zoning, so I don't know if you have a reference on that, but would an unrelated use be, for example, we had an authorized hearing for a large area, it was in the Cedars. We had a project that was trying to come through with some minor changes. They were caught up in the 2-year waiver by a city authorized hearing on the overall zoning and they needed us to address a specific development concern on that property. So that's one where, again, it had nothing to do with this particular applicant, this particular property, but it was within the 2-year waiver because of that larger city-led initiative. Is that correct?
That's right.
And so I'm now going to argue the flip side of the coin. So have there been examples where communities have worked on cases that have been multi-year cases where there has been consensus reached where it was an approval? However, that multi-year process and the compromises and the conditions that came out of that usually ends up being a PD in the cases I've been involved with. Is that one where the 2-year essentially gave everybody a chance to see how it was performing? I mean, would that be a fair assessment of the success of it versus restarting that process?
So your example is, it's a long process to get the PD established. And you think it's a benefit that we have the 2-year waiting period for that approval because you want to evaluate if the PD fits the market before making further decisions, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And I'd say that's true, we're never gonna know exactly how the PDs and the zoning changes play out until, time passes. But it's still, you gotta remember, we have a pretty lengthy process in place anyways for our zoning changes. It takes, I think, a minimum of about 6 months, if that's right. So
Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
general rule of thumb for folks. Okay.
and so it still is a long process to go through the amendments.
I would say, that's a great point. But I think that's the case anyway. I don't know that that's a reason to hold an application when you can always make that call and that decision case by case when a use comes before you and you say, we're just not sure that this is a good land use, at this time, and then, give the friendly denial, the denial without prejudice, and, maybe it's just not ready yet. But I am not sure that that's, reason to hold all of them.
Are you saying that because the discussion would be had anyways when they applied for the change, even if it's before the 2 years, that discussion will happen at CPC? So that's an example.
So, Mr. Reeves, did I see your hand?
Yeah, so just to clarify, if we automatically granted, if they didn't have to go through the waiver process, it still has to go back through the CPC process.
Yes, that is correct.
That is
It's a
correct.
whole
Right,
nother
right. So
layer.
now we've got zoning, we've got the waiver, yes or no. Eight times out of 8, it's been yes. Then the zoning process starts. So we're just getting rid of this
That is
middle
correct.
piece, not getting rid of the zoning process. So okay.
In fact, it's in addition to, it's an additional step, an additional hearing, additional application and time, to review that, it's a whole separate
Right, so-
process tacked on.
So potentially this could actually add a little bit more work to staff if instead of just 8 people that wanted to do this, knowing that they had to go through the waiver process, now if they don't know that they have to go through this, it could be 12 or 15 over that same period, which could have put an additional burden on staff in the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. But
I
still have
wanted
to go through the
to-
process.
Yes. Thank you so much, ZOAC member Reeves. Yes, I wanted to emphasize on that. It's still any kind of change still has to go through CPC.
Right.
It's just that we eliminate or we're trying to be a little bit more friendly to say, okay, we don't need this additional step, because if it's flat, applied to all, it hurts the ones that are more vulnerable. Again, smaller SUP, smaller, I don't even know, tweaks to a PD. Maybe we approved the PD and it went to permitting and it needed a little amendment because you see it doesn't work the way we wrote it, or the development plan needs to be replaced and stuff like that. So I think it just allows the process to more freely do that change or the little tweak. And I think that's the unintended consequence when you have a process like this, that, oh, everybody has to wait for 2 years.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And Commissioner Popkin, did you have a comment? I see that you're unmuted. Okay, just wanted to make sure I wasn't overlooking you. So to follow up to Mr. Dre's comment, I guess one other one I think we received some input on, and actually just had a case at the last CPC meeting where we had a permitting issue. Is it correct that permitting and engineering comments have also led to waivers being filed? Is that correct?
I would imagine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
I-
I know for sure a specific use permit that I think it already came for a waiver in front of you, because there was just the way we measured height on the building and you just took action on height. So again, there are little tweaks, especially when we're talking about existing buildings, infill, small redevelopment. Those are the ones that are struggling the most. And for them, an additional process for a waiver and then for an amendment, actually, it may be a deal breaker.
So, and I see we now have our proposed amendments up on the screen. So Ms. Levy, do you want to walk us through those?
Yeah, so
Now that we've
Well,
lost them.
They have it up on the screen.
So it
We
is-
don't.
It is in everybody's case report. Okay.
yeah, so sorry.
So for our members who are here, we're having trouble with our video. So this is page 3 of our case report.
Yes, it's page 3, and
I printed it, but I didn't bring it.
and of course I'll read them for the benefit of everyone. So what staff is proposing, and seems like a fairly simple change, but I think it has a big impact. And if you'll notice in the case reports, the strikeouts are the words being removed. So what we're proposing is that the 2-year limitation would read under section D, 1, except as provided in subsections D2 and D3, after a final decision is reached by the commission or city council denying a request for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary, no further applications may be considered for that property for 2 years from the date of the final decision. Number 2, if the commission or city council renders a final decision of denial without prejudice, the 2-year limitation is waived. So again, that it's very important how that denial is read into the motion, whether it's with prejudice or without prejudice.
City.
Yeah.
Specific use permit. And impose the time. So, can you explain to me, and maybe I'm not reading it right, the strikeout section that says, or if the city council grants a specific use permit and imposes a time limit of 2 years or less. So this is specifically, what I'm understanding, this is specifically for SUPs and that have a 2-year time limit or less. So if it has more, this does not apply. So are you striking that out because because if you go through the process, this would be 2 years anyhow?
What we're saying now is the SUPs, if they're granted approval, they don't have this 2-year limitation anymore. In other words, anything that's granted an approval, whether it be an SUP, a straight zoning case, a PD, whatever it is, if it's granted an approval, it doesn't have the 2-year limitation anymore on that property, is what we're saying.
Right,
It's
so-
only the denials with,
Right, but I
Yeah,
think Commissioner Blair's question is, the current provision, if the SUP was granted, if it was 2 years or less, they were able to have the waiver. That is
Right.
now redundant, because you're
Right.
saying anything
Correct.
that was
I think-
approved
yes.
Can
yes.
I
Because
interject for a
as-
second?
as proposed again.
Yeah.
Body is deliberating this. Mr. Duran.
So the provision that we have in the code, the one that is strike out right now, says that if your SUP was for 1 year, for instance, you can come back for a renewal within 1 year. You don't have to wait 2. It says that the SUP time limit supersedes the 2-year waiting period. So you don't get, the waiver is waived, if it makes sense, or the 2-year waiting period is waived automatically.
Okay, I get it. I get it. I just didn't get it.
No, I, yours. Thank you, Mr. Duran.
I was running my
I
head.
think it was just trying to understand what was there, what we're proposing, and how it's different, and with the
Right.
approval,
There's-
it's redundant, which is why it's proposed to be struck as we're reviewing it, so.
There is
That is
more to the
correct.
section, and I'm just showing here, I know you can't see it on the screen, I'm sorry.
No, I think a lot of us have the case report out, which has the whole section.
Yeah, so D, you know, everything stays the same, and that's all we're showing. You know, it goes on to read in section D, a property owner may apply for a waiver of the 2-year limitation in the following manner. And it just explains that process. The applicant shall submit his request in writing to the director. The director shall inform the applicant of the date on which the commission shall consider his request and shall advise the applicant of his right to appear before the commission. No changes there, of course. Commission may waive the time limitation if there are changed circumstances regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing. A simple majority vote by the commission is required to grant the request. If a rehearing is granted, the applicant shall follow the procedure for an amendment to this article or a request for a change in zoning district classification or boundaries. So again, to, I believe it was Mr. Reeves' comment or question about whether they still had to follow the usual process, yes, they do. So if it gets waived, then they go through the normal channels of CPC and city council. And then C, if the commission denies the request, the applicant may appeal in writing to the city council by filing an appeal with the director. So none of that's being changed.
Mr. McGregor, you have a question?
I did, as long as we're updating and cleaning this section, 3A refers to the applicant being a male, applicant should submit his request in writing. Can we change that to there or gender neutral? Either his, hers, or,
The request?
yeah, so to say the applicant shall submit their request,
The request.
their request.
A request?
A request.
You are a attorney.
How are you
I
wanting
would
this?
change the gender of the pronoun,
Yeah.
that's all.
Oh,
I'm saying.
yes. Y'all have any?
Gender neutral. I would just go with the applicant shall submit the request in writing to the director.
Yes, that sounds good.
Mr. City Attorney.
Sounds good.
Shall submit the request.
Yeah.
Bring it up to the time.
Yeah, we got you.
Good catch. Mr. Hall.
The request. The request. Okay, yes, that makes sense.
In 3B, changed circumstances, is there any need to elaborate on what the changed circumstance might be?
No, and, you know, I did a review on 15 cities, and a lot of the other cities have that same language. You know, maybe it's not verbatim, but, you know, it's about significant change circumstances. But they're not quantified, if you will, elaborated on, or there's nothing in the code that tells you what that is. And, you know, again, by putting that in here, you would really box yourself in. because you cannot think of every single circumstance, so it's better to have it general so that you can, as a body, as well, CPC as a body, a commission, can make those decisions on that particular property at that particular time, because you just can't cover everything. You can't think of every single thing. You'd probably be changing this ordinance quite a bit if you tried to do that.
So I guess two examples that we have in the chart to follow up on that question, both Baltimore and Boston, and I'll use Boston. It says specific and material changes in conditions upon which the decision was made. I mean, it's page 6 of the case report.
Are you on the other cities?
Yes.
Okay, I
I'm
advanced.
still on Boston. And then
I just have a summary on,
when it comes
see it
up,
up there. I have a summary of, of that chart. If you'd like, I can kind of go through that.
well, and I guess just to Mr. Hall's question, I mean, that at least seems to give some indication, because as we were discussing, as it's currently written, change circumstances gives no criteria. And tornado, I think, was the only thing where the staff's recommendation of approval. And so it would seem like, as much as there was more clarity, Baltimore uses detailed description of how the application is substantially different or substantial new evidence justifies consideration. Again, those still seem to allow for latitude. But again, I don't know how much it makes sense to have clarity versus allowing for a broader consideration, as much as that may be needed. I mean, change property circumstances, I believe, is why we're all here now, is that there was some real questions about what that could actually entail. And I think it was generally, I think staff has said, viewed it on a more limited basis, and we're trying to address that now. So I have my follow-up question, and I guess as we're evaluating that, was there any consideration of a director to waive the 2-year limitation in cases, for instance, the two that I'm most familiar with, where there was a city authorized hearing or where there was a city determination either in the permitting or engineering review? I mean, would that be another approach versus simply saying anything that was approved was not subject to the waiver? Was that anything the staff had evaluated?
I think that if we want to leave it up to staff, we would rather just take the granting, the 2-year waiting period for granted out, because I think it's a slippery slope to allow staff to have that, latitude to say, oh, this is worth it and this one's not,
Well, and I was putting it in those two very specific conditions.
Yeah.
It was a city authorized hearing, or
Mhm.
it was a city action that was requiring them to return. Again, whether it was engineering, whether it was a permitting review comment, whether it was a city authorized hearing. But again, if the city was essentially necessitating the waiver to be filed, that seemed like a pretty clear instance that could be evaluated.
Well, and like the city, like the only reason why you'd have to do a waiver is if you need a change within 2 years.
Correct.
So I mean, maybe like for example, let's just say they want to develop a piece of property that's on the thoroughfare plan, that abuts the thoroughfare plan, and the applicant forgot to check if they're gonna have to dedicate some right of way, to the thoroughfare, to the planned thoroughfare when they plat. And so now they have to, now the place where they were going to build the building is in the front yard setback because the
Setback.
right of way moved inward. And so then they'll have to come in, or they could just wait 2 years. Which going through engineering, I think that there is probably, I know I've had some people that just is like, yeah, I'm just gonna wait 2 years. It's fine.
Well, sometimes the development timeline
Yeah.
that's within what they
Yeah.
need. And I know we've seen cases where they've come in 18 months. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
sometimes it's a problem, sometimes
Right.
it is not a challenge for the projects.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, again, I think, the way we're looking at it though, again, is you know, if we want if we say we want development and we want to
What one house?
review our processes and make them a lot more efficient, you know, so that we get development and, you know, for good customer service, then, you know, I think that's what we're trying to do really at the end of the day. That's, you know, we're saying, you know, let's just let the ones that are denials, you know, without prejudice, those are the ones that really we wouldn't want to see come right back, right? After all that time was spent, but, you know, this gives the commission that latitude to say, you know, hey, you know, yeah, that's a great reason, and, you know, who would have ever thought that that would happen, but, you know, you just, you know, it just gives the commission that authority to review case by case. It still leaves an avenue without,
So I noticed on here as well, you've noted that 10 of the 12 cities that staff evaluated have a limitation of less than 2 years. In the 8 cases that we had in the last 2 years, is there a rough time period? Are they coming back in within a year? Are they coming back in 18 months? Do we have a sense if, is the 2 year anything that was evaluated?
Andrea, do you have any read on that? Because I don't know about the time frame. I mean, we did the 2 fiscal years.
Why
I'm
did
not
we
sure.
put, the question is, why did we put 2 years?
Oh,
Well, was there any consideration? So 2 years is our standard currently, but in the other cities that were evaluated, it says that most are less than 2 years.
that's
and-
2 years.
In the 8 cases that we looked at, are we seeing the requests coming in 18 months? Are we seeing them coming in 12? I mean, is there any average there?
I don't know. I'm sorry. Like that would be like I need to go and look at all of those that we've
No,
done in
and
the
I was
last,
just
I
thinking,
don't know, few years. I
Staff
don't
had
know.
looked at the 8 in the last 2 years, so I was just wondering if there was if we knew what that time period was.
From my
That that could
recollection,
be evaluated.
from my recollection, there was one downtown that had a video board, SUP, and they wanted to open a completely unrelated use on the same site with a new SUP. So, and I think that one was
A year,
probably,
a little
yeah,
over,
within a
15
year or
months.
so, yeah. And there were some others similar to that, or,
Well, I know we had one specifically that I recall, it was literally 18 months, because the question was, they were effectively, by the time they came back to us, it would have been 2 years. And
right,
so it was unclear why the waiver was needed, because they weren't gonna get to us.
yeah, within 2 years,
Right,
right,
so,
yeah.
okay.
Hey,
Questions
this
online?
is-
Yes, Mr. Reeves.
I have another question about the 8 that were granted. Were any of those denials with prejudice that were brought back, or were they all how many were denied with prejudice that were brought back of that 8?
I don't think
I
any
guess
of
would be
them-
none.
Yeah, I think none of them were denials
It was
with prejudice.
approvals.
They were all
Yeah.
applications. that were
Approvals, I believe.
And I think 3 years ago, there was 2 that were denied with prejudice that were, granted a waiver. One of them it was changing from an R75 to an industrial district with a warehouse because it was abutting I-30 and there was no connections to the site except through the interstate. And council denied it with prejudice. And within 2 years, a charter school wanted to go in, and that waiver was granted because it was a completely different use.
Right.
Yeah, and I can't remember what the other denial was. I remember that one because the original zoning case was fine. I was like, oh, okay.
And I see we have Commissioner Carpenter with us this morning. Good morning, Commissioner Carpenter. Did you have any questions as our members?
I had a couple of comments that, several of the requests for waivers we've had this last year have been because of SUPs granted for video boards. I think it was at least 2 and maybe 3 because a renewal had for the video board had come up within the 2-year period. There was then the future zoning, the zoning case that was, being considered, I think one was for something to do with DART, and the other one was either a use that needed an SUP. And so I think that was an inadvertent consequence of I don't think it was ever intended that they should have to go through the waiver process for completely unrelated use if a video board SUP had been granted. And I remember one was for a new type of sign at a school because the DISD wants the real-time video board so that they can send messages to parents and students that are arriving, and it needed to be in a place that was, I think, within the front yard setback or something like that. So I don't think we've had any that were denials with prejudice. Because most of the time, if we have denials with prejudice, it's because there's just a wholesale rejection of whatever the use is that is being proposed there. And if it's taken enough staff time and neighborhood opposition to get to a denial with prejudice, nobody wants to see them come back in 2 years unless there is some fundamental wholesale reimagination of the project, and in which case I think the CPC would be evaluating that request for the waiver, because what we're proposing here, if I'm understanding it correctly, is a wholesale change. We would just be getting waivers requests going forward if the city council had rendered a final decision of denial with prejudice, which moves me back to a question I had, a specific question I had about the changes in the language. I think it was the first page of, it was D1, 2, whatever. It seemed like there were two rather convoluted statements that could have been more easily expressed if it just said the 2-year waiver process only applies to cases where a final decision of denial with prejudice has been reached by the city council. It doesn't apply to anything else. It seemed like the proposed language was saying that, but in kind of a convoluted way.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. I think all of us are evaluating the language more broadly as well.
Mm-hmm.
That would be number 1 that she's talking about.
Yeah.
And acceptable.
Can we call that page back? I'm sorry.
Yeah, can you, Ms. Levy, it's page 3 of your case report. It's the full zoning amendment. 701D. I just don't know if you're able to pull the whole thing up, the whole text.
It's down here. Something going on down here. Yeah, maybe. There it is. It doesn't like us. It won't show there for me,
Yeah.
but
I do have it up. I know it's not showing.
So Commissioner Carpenter, is that the
Yeah,
section you were?
because instead of having these 1 and 2, could we not just say that the 2-year limitation, however, the 2-year limitation of process applies after a final decision is reached by council denying or with the denial with prejudice? I mean, that's what these 2 sentences are saying, sort of. To me, that's what they're saying.
to her point, we could, reformat the 1 and 2 to just put the number 2 as the exception, instead of saying except as provided in subsection D2, you would restate what we have left in 2 and say and D3, but
Yeah, because it's really just
Or
except
just
for as provided in D3.
yeah, but I think it would be okay to leave it as is and let, this, when they're reviewing the final ordinance for city council that our attorneys off, during the city attorney review, they can make that decision on.
And so, but into Commissioner Carpenter's question, we would need to keep commission or council, because if the commission does denial
But
with prejudice, they can appeal the city council. So really, it could be either body that made the
And
decision.
it's in
Is that
both
correct?
1 and 2.
Right. Okay, so deny a request for a change in zoning.
Right. But I mean, basically, for number 2, it says renders a final decision of denial without prejudice or approval, really. I mean.
Well, I think staff's recommendation is to remove the approval, that it would only be in the case of denial, which is denial with prejudice.
Right. It just seems clear. It would be clear to me if just if when legal does its review, if it just said more in a more straightforward fashion that this waiver process is only going to apply to cases that have got denials with prejudice.
No, I would agree, and I think that would allow us to strike D2, because again, if you're denial without prejudice, or in that case, an approval, as is being proposed, we don't need that.
Right.
But
It
we're
just
gonna leave
seems
that to
convoluted.
legal to work, right?
I think so. 'Cause I don't think we're gonna get this done on time.
We're taking notes, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Other comments, questions from members?
Oh, I do have one other question. I'm sorry.
Yes, Commissioner Carpenter.
Yeah, the sticking point for CPC has been the phrase, the changes to the property itself. And it seems to me that the staff isn't recommending that would be changed.
Correct. The discussion about changed circumstances,
Right.
material changes.
Yeah, because I mean, changed circumstances, I think we don't struggle with, but it's when you narrow it down with to the property, that's where staff has interpreted that very narrowly. And most of I think all the time, these last 8 cases, the CPC has decided to go ahead and approve it, but it causes a little seasickness with some of the CPC members because, they think they're not or they don't feel that they're adhering to the strict standard that's in the waiver. So I'm wondering, is it the intention of staff to just leave it that way, or is there a better wording that would give a little more leeway for changed circumstances that don't get narrowed further by to the property?
Answer that.
Repeat what you said, Deborah.
Well, I think
You want me to
I can
repeat all of that?
I didn't.
I got it.
I'm going to
Okay,
try to
go ahead.
restate. Or Mr. Dre, do you want to try to restate?
Yes, I think Commissioner Carpenter's point was, and I have 2 points that if you would allow me, I wanted to also make. Thank you. So yes, it is true that this was initiated by City Plan Commission, and I think it was initiated because we always have this conversation about what is a change in circumstance to the property. And what I explained was staff was always a rationale that's outside of your control and stuff like that. And Commissioner Carpenter is saying that is not the change in circumstance that is the one that's spurring most discussion, is actually to the property, because you may have change in circumstance to the applicant or the developer or the owner. And that is not ever taken into consideration because it's always narrowed down to the property. So I think it's basically asking the question for staff and for ZOAC as a body, if we want to go back and consider tweaking a little bit the language and maybe taking out to the property. What would that mean and how would that apply?
If I can add something, because if we're going to be looking at the 2-year waivers only for projects that have received denials with prejudice, then it seems to me that it would probably be, I'm trying to imagine a circumstance where you could justify giving a waiver because of a change of property. It would more likely be there's been some just wholesale change in what however the project is conceived to be. Although I guess the example that Ms. May gave about the charter school would probably fall into that.
Wouldn't that be like also when we have an if you go through an authorized hearing process and you're at the end of that process and if the zoning is changed?
Yeah, that's my case in the Cedars. The authorized hearing required them, and they were both an authorized hearing and permitting required them to come back.
Ah,
Right, but they hadn't gotten a denial with prejudice.
Correct. And so as this is proposed, it would not be an issue.
It would just automatically come back to CPC to start the process of approval.
Correct. Okay. So, hang on one second. So, to Commissioner Carpenter's point, this goes back to the language of our 2 other cities we reviewed. Well, and I'm unclear. So if we said change circumstances whether we kept that language and integrated specific and material changes and conditions upon which decisions were made, whatever I mean, is that type of language, but does it still need to be tied to the property? I guess is the question. Zoning goes with the land, so is it inferred by default that the request would be subject to whatever the site was? Do you need the language, the property? And that may be a question for the city attorney.
And I'd say like when I've seen this go through CBC, it's been a while, I'm sorry. It seems like during the waiver, the hearing for a 2-year waiver, I think everybody's very careful that the merits of the new application is not part of the discussion. Because we're not going to say, oh, well, we're okay with a charter school, but we're just not okay with another warehouse. They have to
Because that must be
explain.
reviewed in that
Yes.
separate case.
Yes, and so like I think there's merit in still tying the waiver request to changes in the property, because we can't really consider the different elements of whatever they're going to bring forward in the waiver application, if that makes sense.
I feel
But I'm
like
not sure that,
it would have merit because the decisions we're charged with is land use, but it's on that property, and zoning goes with the property, not with the person. And I kind of feel like they're saying, it's the property, not the applicant, not even necessarily the owner. It's that parcel doesn't change, that doesn't move, but circumstances to that property.
Circumstances that affect the
Right,
property,
exactly.
not necessarily
again,
to the property itself, that affect the property.
so I think perhaps the nuance here is that I would agree with Ms. May. I don't think anyone on the commission, and I'll let Ms. Begray weigh in, I don't think staff would have this, or Ms. May or Ms. Levy. It's not that we're reviewing whether the use is appropriate. Is it a different use? In other words, a charter school to a warehouse, or a charter school to a R75. That is a different application. It's a completely different
Right.
request.
That's correct.
And so you're evaluating, okay, does the body need to consider that as a change?
So
I would
and-
add something if I may. I think we had a what if with Sarah about like the future application, but we have another what if when we're talking about, again, small tweaks, small corrections. Well, if it would apply only to denial,
So, one kind of-
I'll pause now. I do have another question though. But I want this conversation to end, and then I'll jump. I have
Well-
another point that I wanted to ask.
Okay, well, we've got 3 people in the queue. So I've got Mr.
I'm
McGregor, Mr. Reeves, and then Commissioner Blair, or
No, I'm
Vice Chair
good.
Blair.
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, so Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to come back to 3A and point out that there's 2 places in that paragraph where the male pronoun is used, so come up with.
Catch them both.
Yes, catch them both. Whatever the change is, just that.
Got it. Mr. Reeves.
Yeah, so
Please.
on page, and I think this was a slide, the slide before this one, where you said further to grant a waiver, the commission must also consider what is, quote, change circumstances regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing. Can you pull that up? I think it was on the previous slide.
And no, I think it's here. It's D3B.
Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. Okay. So really, just to frame this, and I'm in corporate training, I can't help myself. That sentence, change circumstances regarding the property sufficient. So we could say, if there are changed circumstances, delete regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing. So the question is, that may be too far, right? To frame this, like change circumstances sufficient to warrant a new hearing might be too much of a Pandora's box that we're opening up, correct? So then if we don't want to like go that route, Chair Hampton, what you said about if there were changes based on the original decision points, I think did kind of encompass not only the property, but that use that somebody wanted to do a school or a warehouse, you know, it was a completely different use. So it's just that what we're looking at is that regarding the property, that's the three words that we're looking at that we need to better define, correct?
That's the question, yes.
Okay.
So, but if
So
it
anyway,
was,
I liked your, like, if there's changes to the points that the decision was made on,
Right.
I kind of like that.
Conditions.
And Commissioner Carpenter, I loved your calling it seasickness with a couple of the commissioners. I like that term. That's a good technical term. I like that.
So from the city attorneys or from staff standpoint, if it was changes in conditions upon which the decision was made, does it need to reference the property? And again, then the balance of the sentence sufficient to warrant a new hearing. Is that a standard that could be applicable?
That's a good question, and we're both new to zoning, so I may have to pass that along to Brian or Casey and then circle back to you, if that's okay, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think also
And
maybe Andrea could.
I think if you get into
Mr.
that,
Doss.
and you're gonna start rehearing the original case, then you have to dig in. The waiver is just to determine
Can it be filed?
is the new application substantially different enough than the one that was denied previously with prejudice.
Right? It's still coming back to CPC to make that
Might as well just not.
determination.
It does.
Process, because you're gonna be looking at the merits of the case, which is what you do with a rezoning application. The waiver process should be just to determine, is this different enough to warrant a new hearing, or are there circumstances that have occurred since that denial with prejudice that have sufficiently changed the circumstances under which the property is to be developed? And that isn't simply if just an ownership changes happen, you know, and of course
It could
that's
be
for the
ownership,
city
it
planning
could be
commission.
use, it could be, yeah. Again.
It's case by case, and I think that's also the benefit of keeping the parameters by which you determine if the waiver is appropriate, general in nature, so that CPC can use their discretionary authority to determine that. But I do think it's important to put guide rails on there to say, well, a change in ownership on its own
Is not.
is not enough. It's not a change in applicant is not sufficient. Oh, I hired a new, better land use attorney. That's not sufficient. But
It goes back to, and again, the first part of the sentence was specific and material changes. And again, I'm pulling that straight from one of our reference cities.
That's what it says.
And is there any
Because it's the property, it's not the applicant.
that, you know, the waiver granted will result in a significantly changed application?
There is no guarantee of anything.
Right.
No,
So, I mean,
I think it's just, and again, this goes back to the point that Commissioner Carpenter raised, and when you go back and look, I think Ms. Levy started with it. This began because as the waivers were coming through, the commission was evaluating them, and those 5 words, change circumstances regarding the property, that was really the piece that was asking to be evaluated. I think if staff has looked into it and understanding that most of these are prior approval, if they're being granted, is it appropriate to consider approvals as well as, and they can already come back for denial without prejudice. And so then we're now talking about denial. So what would be the standard? How do we define the standard that, and to Mr. Doss's point, provides the flexibility, but enough guide rails so that we understand what we're evaluating?
So go back to the like you're saying, the purpose that in which we are here.
Right.
And
What's our charge?
what's our charge? I think that what we're doing is wordsmithing the pronouns too much.
Needed, but that was a clear one, I think, to get.
But and I'm just saying, so if the purpose here is to allow enough flexibility to bring cases back in where so that staff has more freedom and we have more freedom to look at the things that need to be reviewed opposed to having everything be reviewed, correct?
I think that has been a byproduct of staff's evaluation.
Okay, so that's so then the charge would be, if that's a byproduct of staff's determination, to broaden their view or their ability to get past.
It's probably more flexibility for
For the-
applicants.
Yeah,
I mean, that's, I think by shifting the focus to denial with prejudice, that's really what will come back to CPC at this point.
denial with prejudice. Cases that we had denial, because if we have a case that has denial with prejudice, they can conceivably go back tomorrow and reapply, or but cases that are without prejudice, they can conceivably the next day tweak some words and come back in through the process.
Correct. Which is generally 6 months.
Yes.
Longer, depending on the complexity of the cases. And so then again, going back to, okay, now we've evaluated that, and this body will make whatever determination we deem appropriate. Then the core charge, change circumstances regarding the property, and I'm going to look to everyone to nod or weigh in. It sounds like evaluating that language, such as specific and material changes in conditions sufficient to warrant a new hearing. I mean, I think that final language is something that needs to be vetted by the city attorney's office to tell us that that is
appropriate,
is an understood standard, if you will, that could be interpreted.
Again,
yes, misleading.
All of the, in the research, none of the other cities did define it. Now, at least one of them did put the burden on the applicant, I guess, if you will, which I guess it should be on the applicant anyway, just by saying they had to, submit a detailed statement justifying their consideration. I don't know if that's something we could just elaborate, that it's.
Well, and I think they do
cover
right
that
now.
in A, don't
Yeah.
they? Because item A says the applicant shall submit the request in,
Again,
correcting the request.
At the end of the day,
to the
the commission
director.
still has to make that decision. That's their charge, though.
Yeah, agreed. So members online, Commissioner Carpenter.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify that, yeah, my understanding of why this is at ZOAC is because if you listen to the CPC hearings about waivers, we have the same discussion each and every time, because at least the 8 that have come to us in the last year, they were all for, at least the way I remember it, they were all for projects that were approved, and that the changes that were being requested were things that no one really had any quarrel with, but the very high bar set by the wording of the code, this change circumstances regarding the property, always triggered. I mean, we had identical conversations, and usually fairly lengthy ones, every single time, asking what constituted an acceptable change to the property. So the staff's proposal that this 2-year waiver process only apply to denials with prejudice will take most of those cases out of consideration, because we won't be getting waivers requests for cases that have gotten approvals or denials without prejudice. But I'm wondering if, even looking at the denials with prejudice, if we could look at some language that says something like significant or sufficient change circumstances regarding the use of the property.
We certainly can. I think that our staff, I think, is thinking that use may be too narrow is part of what I think I'm hearing in the discussion. I would say, and I'll defer to the other members, I think we've got some items that we'd like staff and the city attorneys to look at and to bring revised language back to us before we move this on to City Plan Commission. There's just enough moving parts, I think, in how we're evaluating this. And I can take a pass at noting the things I've got noted, which are primarily to look at combining section 1 and 2. Well, these are all within D, so I'm just going to focus on the numbers, and likely deleting item 2 based on some of our current conversation, because it would become redundant with what's in item 1. Grammatical cleanup within 3, grammatical / pronouns. And then within the changed circumstances in 3B, to evaluate, the changed circumstances regarding the property for language that would address specific and material changes in conditions or similar language that would allow for a standard to be established.
I wouldn't mind accepting all those changes as long as our council didn't tell us that any of that was a bad idea. And I don't have any objections to any of those modifications.
Well, I'll let the members decide if they want to see it come back to us, or if they'd like it, if they feel comfortable with the direction, because I think truly it's going to be wordsmithing by the city attorney's office
It's gonna
at
happen.
this point, right? So,
Yeah, this is Mark. I think I'd like to see this come back. I mean, I love where this is going. I agree with Commissioner Carpenter. This was a seasick experience every single time that wasted a lot of time, and you didn't need to get seasick on this. So, 99% of everything that we have here is awesome. But, to change those 5 little words and let's see what we're talking about there. And then I think we need to discuss, is it too much? Is it not enough? Or do we kind of hit a medium ground based on those words? And I'd like to see those words personally.
So would you like a motion made?
I think yes. Are there any further comments before we do? And I see a couple of hands. I'm glad I've gone online. Mr. Dredd, did you want to go first, and then I'll get Commissioner Carpenter?
That's fine.
Commissioner Carpenter, yes, I do have a question. Would ZOAC consider maybe taking it a little bit further and carving out SUPs? Because again, you may get an SUP denial, and again, those are for use, right? But in the example of, let's say you have a video board that's denied that has nothing to do with what's going on inside the building. Maybe I want a daycare or whatever is inside the building.
So, and Mr. Dredd, I think I understood from staff's presentation that this would apply to both zoning changes and SUPs. So do you think we need to explicitly state that?
No, I want the commission, I want ZOAC
To make that statement as well. So this is under.
No, to think, what if the 2-year waiting period does not apply to SUPs at all? Would we consider
denials?
What do we think about that?
But, so, no, because SUP is still a land use question.
It's a zoning change.
It's a zoning change or a change in classification of the land use, right?
But it would only be a denial with prejudice. So can you give an example of where you think that would be appropriate? If it was an SUP, it was a denial with prejudice.
Yes, I'm thinking the simplest example is where you may have overlapping SUPs on the same property for different type of uses, like a retail strip. We do, I know it's getting a little bit technical, we usually do SUPs by the property. Sometimes we do them by meets and bounds to only apply to that unit. We can treat it like that. Again, SUP is not, it is a zoning change for our staff determination, but basically it's an allowable use. You don't change anything that's underlying zoning with an SUP. You just allow or not allow, in this situation, a use under some conditions. So I think SUPs are a little bit of a more gray area, and those are time limit. I mean, again, think about denials. I need to always go back and think about what if we deny an SUP for use in a, let's say, commercial strip or somewhere in downtown, but we deny it for this specific use, but it's okay if it comes back in a year for a different use.
So can I ask something, make sure I'm tracking with you, Dr. Udira? So if I have a SUP come before, that wants to be a CS, commercial services, where they're doing.
But that's a zoning change.
Okay, but
It's
you
not
need
a
an SUP
Oh, for your convenience.
for your convenience store. And then we have a denial that said no, but because it was denied with prejudice, right?
Right.
Then it comes back within that 2-year period for SUP for a alcohol sales.
Well,
Right.
convenience stores are not subject to SUPs. So let's say if we are to do like a real, for instance, I'm thinking,
A batch
I mean,
plan.
we can,
A batch plan. Let's put a batch
I
plan in the
don't, they kind
backyard,
of
right?
like,
A commercial amusement inside.
Okay, commercial.
I think the
music.
perfect example is the video board sign that we had in downtown. Like if the video board sign was straight denied, it triggers that no SUP application can be made for the building for the next 2 years. And it may be, yeah, a commercial amusement inside, for instance, in downtown.
Or naked.
Think of a situation where you may have overlapping SUPs.
So what you're
Late
saying,
night hours.
Or late hours, yes.
so are we saying that the SUP that's first denied with prejudice, then the second one cannot come back within a 2-year period, but you're asking if the second one that has a material change in use, I'm using the right words, right? That it can come back.
But that would be subject to the waiver. I think what Dr. Dre is saying is exempt SUPs from being applicable to the waiver.
I wouldn't want to do that.
Well, that's a.
I don't think.
That's a question that I had.
Okay, and for me, if it's a land use process, then the waiver should apply. This process should apply.
And I think where Dr. Dre's rationale is coming from, just like all the other things we're talking about, is that if it truly is different, if it was
Yes.
the overall zoning, or again, the video board was here and the use was down here, but this got denied for
Yes.
whatever reason, this was going to impact a use that had no relationship whatsoever to this other case
Yes.
that was denied. And again, I'm trying to think through how, and again, I know we're trying to think more globally and being efficient in the processes, but how often does this apply,
I would say that it may hurt, for instance, type of uses that, I mean, I know we're all thinking about alcohol sales and all of that, but for instance, childcare facility requires SUP the same as community service center. So if we deny an SUP, and it may come in a retail strip or in a, I don't even know, we had situations with, like you have a community service center and they need an SUP for something that's a complementary use or something like that. There are other uses that are more gentle and may be hurt by this, process.
But do those applications get denied with prejudice? Normally?
No, but you may deny the alcohol one. That's what I'm thinking.
with
We
prejudice?
may deny.
I'm not just trying to, I mean,
That's
I can't
true.
remember
That's
our video board. Would we deny a video board with prejudice?
No,
That's
we,
true. It takes a lot to deny an SUP.
It takes a
denial,
lot.
unless it's
yeah.
To deny
It's,
anything.
And to Commissioner Carpenter's point, that was the other thing I was trying to think through is how often do we deny with prejudice?
SUPs.
All-
Yeah.
Well,
Anything.
SUV zoning, I mean,
Anything.
because I think we all recognize the 2-year limitation and the implications for that. So, but Commissioner Carpenter, you had a question, and I think you have a comment as well.
No, I was following up on what you were just saying. How often do we deny something, an SUP with prejudice? I can only think of a couple of cases for alcohol that involved alcohol beverage establishments where perhaps there was such a bad track record at that particular establishment that the CPC didn't want to was sending a message they did not want to send to see the case coming back for 2 years. But it's very much the exception. But unrelated comment based on the page that's up before us, if we're going to consider deleting number 2, it seems to me number 1 is going to have to clearly say that it's denying the request with prejudice.
Well, and so I
Am I
think,
reading that correctly?
well, I think denying a request, and I guess the way it's always, a denial is
Well-
denial prejudice. We don't typically,
Well, no, there's denial. Most of
Well, you have
most
to
of our
say
denials are
no.
without prejudice.
no, I agree, but I think it has to be denial without prejudice. Otherwise, it's understood to be with, if that makes sense. I think we do
okay.
typically state it for clarity.
So I
For our
see what you're saying.
members.
But
And
did,
well,
is that
Mr.
what,
City Attorney, I think we'd ask for you to clarify that. Do we need to in fact say, so that there is no ambiguity, that it is a
Right.
denial with prejudice versus just denial?
Because we're going to be taking out the first exception. I'll let it go. I just think it needs to be word. It needs to be
No, I
rewritten
don't think you should
legal and
Yeah,
they'll straighten it out.
yeah.
I-
No,
I-
if we're having 3 different opinions here.
I don't think it needs to be
There
moved up.
there will be more,
Yeah.
2 weeks from now, so
That's something we're happy to look at when we review.
thank you.
Yes.
Well, can I go back to question?
Yes.
Can I go back to Dr. Ujira question about gray area and SUPs and if I am understanding, Dr. Ujira, that you were saying with SUPs that we could have 2 SUPs for the same piece of land, and that you're asking to exempt SUPs from this process. Is that correct? And we're saying that SUP should still be included. It's the with prejudice portion that we're talking about. And I don't know if I'm the only one who would feel this way, but I think that any land use that has a with prejudice connotation to it, and you're coming in with a different land use, that the CPC should treat it as should see it again, and there should be a waiver attached to it to eliminate shopping for something to get a use in that particular land that could be contrary to what needs to happen. And I'm asking you, Dr. Bujet, are you thinking that any type, if we remove, if you have a SUP, whether the first one was with prejudice, all SUPs are going to come before CPC anyhow? I'm thinking out loud.
I think she's
Yes,
thinking.
I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm thinking. And I think my intention is, again, if you have a mixed use building or a mixed use property, that may need overlapping SUPs, again, you may deny one use, but that kind of like triggers that the entire property needs to wait for 2 years to apply for an SUP for something else. Or for even like a general zoning change. I don't know. I don't know. Do we want to think about SUPs a little bit differently because they are a little bit more gray and yes, they all come in front of us anyway. It's just, do we want to allow them to come, or do we need that 2-year buffer? And you're gonna do just uses that are allowed by right, and you don't apply for any SUP if we denied one SUP on your property or in your building. There are a multitude of uses in any zoning district that require SUP or
Yeah.
Uh,
are subject to an SUP.
So what you're proposing is some sort of exception that says if one suite of a multi-tenant property receives a denial without prejudice for an SUP, that does not automatically trigger the need for a waiver for another SUP application for another suite. Seems to be maybe some.
And even like on the same suite, let's say I tried for an alcohol serving use, or I tried for a late hour, but then I know that there is another use. I'm gonna use like these examples, they're not from real life. I wish I did my research, but let's say I denied the late hours, but I would like for a childcare to come in there in the same suite. Does it make sense?
Well, yeah.
Well, it would just,
So I don't know how to carve that out.
well, it would just come back through the waiver process.
Mhm.
It would be
And we
very-
cannot consider what's gonna come next, so we have to consider the change in circumstance.
Right. Yeah, so then we'd be back to arguing change circumstances regarding.
Exactly, exactly.
And we could
But on the
also-
other hand, it
we
does
could
have
also
unintended
rest during that
consequences.
discussion, yes.
Yes, it does have unintended consequence. You may have an applicant that's gonna apply for the same alcohol sales or late hours every 6 months, right?
Does staff need, if this is coming back to ZOAC, does staff need more time to think through all the variations in SUPs to perhaps make some other suggestion?
I will leave it out to Sarah. I think this is a very good discussion, and I think that was the purpose, to have a very, very good and wealthy discussion on all angles. So I do welcome this
Well,
and appreciate it.
if we have,
Commissioner Blair?
okay,
Vice Chair Blair?
yeah, if we're having this much discussion on the SUP,
Oh, it's coming back.
it needs to come back.
So I will say, and I kind of threw the question out there. I didn't hear any comments back. Is any comments or thoughts on the 2-year period? I think what I'm hearing is we would like staff to bring back a little bit more data on the SUP, the denial without prejudice, and where that may fall to help us better evaluate if that should be considered for an exclusion as we're reviewing this. It may also just be helpful to understand what has been the period. In other words, are requests coming in 18 months? And again, whether you want to use the 8 you've already evaluated in the last 2 years, if you want to go back a little bit further. My sense is that they've all been over a year, but I don't know that we've really talked about that. Again, understanding how other cities are approaching that time period. Mr. Reeves.
Yeah, so my feeling is if we have this where you can come back for like, so this is a denial with prejudice, and you can come back and it's not only the property, but it's also extenuating circumstances, then the 2 years doesn't bother me, because you're giving them an out and a reasonable reason to come back at that point. So, if we just said property and that's all we could do, then I would say, okay, then possibly make it a year. But if we say property and other things that we based our decision on, then I don't think 2 years is out of the question or out, crazy.
I will tell you that's my sense as well, that as we're evaluating everything, throwing it out there for the discussion for the members, so.
And I would say too, and I had to bail out for about 3 minutes. I had to move offices in different background in here, is that with an SUP, it's kind of a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-many. If, you know, I had a bar down in Deep Ellum that we denied with prejudice because there were people dying in the bar and outside in the parking lot. And we were like, you're done. Well, it was a bar, one property, one SUP, and it didn't affect anything else. So that was a 1-to-1. But if you're talking about that, it's a suite on a bigger piece of property, then that's a 1-to-many. And so is there some sort of a legal term, like if the property is only one use, it's a 1-to-1, then that's one way to look at it. But if it's a 1-to-many, there's multiple uses on a larger piece of property, then I totally get, you know, maybe that's the way to look at it.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think you've spurred some discussion with staff that will be coming back to us.
Okay.
So I have 6 items listed that I'm going to read. Is there any further comments or discussion? Yes, Ms. Lee.
This may be for the attorneys. I'm just wondering, where it says no further applications may be considered for that property. I'm wondering, instead of no further applications, no subsequent applications, would that be more like the same application? You know, not that we have other applications for that property, like for the SUP, but subsequent meaning, you know, that further, would that or another term be a little more defining to the same application, in other words, coming back?
I can see how that might, subsequent might seem like it's more limited to that initial, what do you think?
I think maybe no applications for, well, could you say no application for the same property, or would that?
I think that goes back to the
Yeah,
1-to-the-many
that's kind of
question.
already-
If you're in a building with a suite versus a suite and a suite. And that's where I think the question of property, and so to me, property almost ties back to what we're looking at in 3B. We're saying change circumstances, whatever language we land on for the property. How is the property considered? I think both of those would end up going hand in hand.
I'm sure it's defined. I can look it up.
Definition.
Yeah.
Surely. All right, so I'm going to start reading while Ms. May is looking up, but I think that's going to include property in how we look at that. So under item D1 and 2, to review it with the consideration to strike item 2, within language for D1 to provide clarity on the, well, I've written this very condensed. Review language in D1 for clarity of denial and if with prejudice should be clarified. 3, to amend the pronouns in item 3A to change his to thee. 4, in item 3B, review the language regarding changed circumstances regarding the property to consider language such as specific and material changes in conditions or similar. To review exempting an SUP as a part of the waiver, and staff to provide additional research for consideration by the committee. And then I've noted 6 for a review of the typical time period and whether the 2-year limitation should be further evaluated. So again, that's a staff research.
Correct. On your 3, when you went to 3A,
Yep.
the pronoun, that should be the pronoun to
His to thee.
I know for his to thee in the whole section.
Oh, correct. Sorry.
The
there's
whole
2
section,
in the whole
not
section.
just the,
Right.
not just that one area.
And not necessarily to the other thing we're working through, but we'll just look at it.
To make it pronoun neutral.
And so then I think the property discussion within 3B will also include the consideration of how that might be coordinated with the D1 language. Did I capture everything in a way that was understandable to everyone?
Yes. it's not just coming up.
Yes, Ms. May.
I found some definitions for property, if you'd like me to read those.
Yes, if you would quickly and then
Sure.
we can.
So it's not in chapter 51A, but instead it's in chapter 1, general revisions for the whole city. So think also code compliance and all of our other things, but property, the word property includes real and personal property, and real property, the words real property include land, tenements, and I don't even know that word. Yes, what is that?
Good question.
Huh?
I've never seen that word.
It's like what?
Oh, it's like things you inherit.
Oh, okay. Sure.
If
Things
it
you
means
inherit.
what?
Things something you inherit.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Land you
Land
inherit, I imagine. Or things you
So it hasn't really
Not
helped
really helpful.
advance our conversation. Okay,
And
so we will review if property is the correct terminology for us or if there would be a more relevant
sure.
term as we evaluate this. All right, any final comments? I think that is our direction to staff.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this will come back to us at our next meeting, which will be December
13th, is that right?
Yes, 13th. And I know we have another potential agenda item, but no.
Madam Chair,
Would staff prefer to defer this until our January meeting?
please, I think we're trying to bring,
Comprehensive plans.
the batch plans.
Yes. So just for everyone, staff's reviewing the time period. We have another item that's planned to be before us on the 13th, which will probably be a longer discussion with a lot of information. So this will come back for our first meeting in January. Okay. All right, any further discussion before we go on to other matters? Okay, seeing none. Other matters, approval of our minutes from October the 18th.
Vote to approve minutes from October 18th.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Hall, for your second. So, motion to approve the minutes from October 18th as submitted. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Seeing none opposed, any opposed? Seeing none, minutes are adopted. It is 10:40 a.m. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Vice Chair Blair, for your second. We are adjourned. Thank you all for being with us. Have a